Hey, good evening and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. We're in video number 16 of our study of the prophets in the parables. So tonight I want to jump back into Matthew 21 and the parable of the vineyard. And specifically, I want to take a look at Matthew 21:42 and one of its Old Testament sources, which is Psalm 118, 22 through 23. So notice this. Let's first of all notice the simple connection. Psalm 118, 22, 23 says this: "The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." Now, Jesus in Matthew 21:42, in the context of his condemnation of his generation in the parable of the vineyard, says this: "Did you never read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone? This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Now, the first thing we need to notice, the obvious thing we need to notice, is that Jesus is not literally asking his generation if they've ever read Psalm 118, 22 through 23. Of course they have. That psalm is part of a larger prayer known as the Hallel. And Jews of Jesus' day would sing this on every pilgrimage into Jerusalem for the three major feast days: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, as well as other feast days. So they know this song. They probably knew this psalm verbatim off by heart, okay? He's not asking them if they've ever read it. What he's asking them is, have you never understood this this psalm, Psalm 118, 22 through 23 specifically, to be referring to the Messiah's rejection and the overthrow of your temple and your kingdom, in fulfillment of my parable that I've spoken as well. That's the idea that he's bringing them. Have you never read this psalm in light of what I have just spoken through my parable? And by the way, through his three symbolic acts that he performed within the last 24 hours as well. That's the understanding. Now, before we get into significance of really that question, I want to make a couple obvious applications that we all know, but they warrant mention just in passing. Number one, Jesus is telling the Jews of his day through this parable and through the quotation from Psalm 118 that, number one, they are the builders who are rejecting their Christ, the chief cornerstone. And Peter makes this application in Acts chapter 4, verse 11. Number two, he is telling his generation again through this allusion to Psalm 118 that he is the chief cornerstone. Yes, he will be rejected, but he is about to be laid as the foundation of a new temple for a new priesthood. And I understand that in two ways. Number one, this agrees perfectly with Jesus' second symbolic act, his overthrow of the temple that had become a den of thieves. You see, that one old covenant temple would be destroyed in order to make way for a house of prayer for all nations, a new temple. And as Peter puts it in 1 Peter chapter 2, 4 through 10, that new temple, whom Jesus Christ with the chief cornerstone, would be the temple for the operation of a new covenant priesthood, the body of Jesus Christ. Now, those are the obvious allusions. I want to get into the historical context of Psalm 118, and I want to bring out what Jesus is really telling his generation and how he's redefining the characters from the history of the psalm and applying them to his generation. This is so powerful. Let me begin here. I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs I have written. It helps me communicate these thoughts a little bit clearer. Some believe that the historical context and application of Psalm 118 is King David's ascension to the throne following the death of Saul and the end of his kingdom, that's Saul's kingdom, which had opposed the establishment of David's. In other words, David originally was the rejected cornerstone. He was the one that was to initiate the kingdom of David, the house of the Davidic line, that through whom Messiah was to come. Now watch this. If this be the case, David was the stone that the kingdom of Saul had rejected, who had become the chief cornerstone, that is, the founder of the Davidic kingdom and architect of the temple of God. The parallels between David and the son of David should be obvious. So in other words, just like David was rejected, he had ruled in the midst of his enemies, but eventually that old covenant kingdom that had rejected his rule and reign ended, and he was exalted and established as the founder and the builder of his house and his kingdom, so it was for Jesus, the son of David. Now listen to this. Here's the application to Jesus' day. In the parable of the restoration of the Lord's vineyard, the parable of the vineyard, Matthew 21, 33 and following, Jesus, who is the son of David, replaces King David. And the rulers of Israel replaced the kingdom of Saul. Jesus is now the stone that the rulers of Israel were rejecting. Like David, Jesus would be enthroned as Yahweh's king and become the chief cornerstone, the foundation of his kingdom, and builder of his new covenant temple. And we see that being worked out in the apostolic writings. Furthermore, although Christ's reign began on Pentecost, like David's, it was fully established. It was fully established at the overthrow of his enemies and the end of their earthly kingdom, that is the world of Judaism, in his own generation. So again, just like the parallel, just like David's kingdom, David was anointed king, but the full exercise and establishment of his kingdom did not take place until the old monarchy was ended. So it was with the reign of Jesus. The kingdom ruled and reigned for 40 years, but at the overthrow of the enemies of the kingdom of Saul, Jesus' kingdom was fully established. Now watch this. Jesus was telling an old Israelite story anew. He and his followers, here's the redefinition of the characters. This is so cool. Jesus and his followers now constituted the true Israel and the kingdom of God. They had become David and David's mighty men, his followers who were faithful to the promises made to David, while Judaism and the Jews of Jesus' generation had become the rebellious kingdom of Saul, which was destined to pass away. And this is exactly what we see, by the way, in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1 and following. Jesus, through his parable, through his symbolic actions, and through his allusion to Psalm 118, was telling his generation, specifically those, the builders who would reject his cornerstone, that they had become the kingdom of Saul, and the kingdom of David was being established through the person and work of Jesus Christ, and those who would refuse to abandon the perishing old covenant kingdom of Saul would be judged and crushed by this stone, and those who would receive David as the son of David, receive Jesus as the son of David, would enter this kingdom and inherit the promises made to David. This is absolutely beautiful stuff, and this is a perfect demonstration, my opinion, if I do say so myself, of how Jesus applies the prophets in his parables, redefines the characters, and tells an old story anew, and applies that history and that context. The stories that they knew, that they had memorized, that they had taken place, he is telling them again and applying them prophetically and eschatologically to his first century, last days generation. Jesus, the King of David, was establishing the new covenant temple for a new covenant priesthood, and those who would not follow him were becoming and had become the kingdom of Saul that was growing weaker and weaker and was about to perish in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Well, that's it for now. We'll pick it up next time on Answers on Eschatology, and we'll jump into the second Old Testament source of the parable of the vineyard. God bless. Have a great week. Take care.